Well, I think you can gather from that John is a rigorous researcher. He won't mind me saying he's also a shy engineer who prefers to keep a low profile, but the content of what he's put together is such that it is gradually being noted, and I think I've seen some of the submissions that have gone forward, and gradually I think the perseverance from John and the rest of the team is gradually being noticed. Ian Lowe, the President of the Australian Conservation Council, was keen to be here tonight. He came to our last presentation. He wasn't able to make it because of other commitments, but he did ask that I just read this brief statement, and it's this, that no resource is more important for the future of civilisation than water. It is absolutely essential that governments take responsibility for ensuring the quality and quantity of water. It is impossible to see privatisation as a responsible approach. I applaud the initiative of this important forum and urge all citizens to press your elected governments to continue to fulfil their duty to the community to provide water in an environmentally acceptable way. And I know that the Conservation Council is certainly taking note of all the presentations tonight and will be following up. So that concludes the first part of this, the detailed presentations. Now I'm going to invite Deb Tribe from ABC Radio. We hear her regularly and we certainly listen to the results of her production efforts. And so Deb, it's up to you for now.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thank you, Richard. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'm going to move with lightning speed from here on in. As Richard said, I'm from 891 ABC Adelaide. I'm your facilitator this evening. You're going to hear now some presentations and rights of reply, and they are strictly limited to 3 minutes each. I think Richard's going to be keeping time on that. So I would ask you, if you have some questions in your mind, please make a mental note of them. There will be an opportunity to ask a question of any of our speakers at the end of their sessions. I'm going to get underway very quickly because time is of the essence, and we're going to hear 4 presentations on the topic of what can be done. Now, my introduction is going to be very brief, but if you'd like to learn more about any of the speakers that you've heard tonight, if you just go to this forum's website, you can find more information. Our first speaker tonight is Ross Womersley. Ross is the Executive Director of the South Australian Council of Social Service, otherwise known as SACOS, the peak body for the health and community services sector in South Australia. Please join me in welcoming Ross Womersley.
Thank you, and well done to all of you for making the effort to be out today. I think it's an incredibly important conversation, and I have to say I feel like a bit of a fraud. I think that many of the reflections that I have already been shared, and the way I start, and I'm not sure that I've got a conclusion in a sense of what might be done, but I do have some continuing concerns. Some of which might echo some of the things we've heard. And I guess my concerns start from the point of the question of commodification and what happens when we take a resource and actually make it into a commodity, because in a sense it seems that in that very moment we shift something, we actually turn something. And a commodity is something that people develop a sense of ownership about. And if we reflect on the Murray-Darling Basin, and I think that, you know, some of the statistics that we were just privy to give you a sense of we experienced, particularly in South Australia, a terrible drought. And we perceived as SACOS and anybody that was really paying attention that there were terrible impacts on many communities, particularly many of those communities that were spread right along the Murray River in our riverland. And it's interesting to reflect on whose interests, in fact, keep on being mentioned in that debate. Because from our perspective, the people whose interests we saw being represented were largely the people that had some sort of ownership, some sort of title, some sort of entitlement that they saw themselves, and that was the irrigators and the people who created infrastructure. We argued long and hard and continue to represent the view that there's a whole lot of other people spread throughout all of those communities that actually also merit attention, that also merit some sort of protection. And in a sense, there needs to be not only an investment in protecting the interests of the irrigators, there needs to be a very strong investment in helping communities plan and rebuild in a way that enables them to think about a future that doesn't have quite as much water forming part of the undergrowth, if you like. But we know, of course, that voice doesn't get up. There isn't a lot of conversation because, in a sense, those people don't, in fact, have a place. They don't have the resources. They can't marshal the money together. They don't have the funding structures. And so, hence the importance of groups like this one, the Water Action Coalition, in terms of opportunities for people to come together and to think about these issues and, in fact, to try and advance the interests not simply of a single group in our community, but the interests of a broader group. And I suppose that lies at the centre of, when we think about this idea of a resource becoming a commodity, in a sense, for me, there's a sense in which, for as long as that commodity is actively controlled and well managed by government, then in fact we might, that feels a bit more secure to me. That feels as though there's a little more control over that than when we hand that over into some sort of private interests and private hands. Because in a sense, the bell's ringing, those people quite sincerely have interests that are different to those of us as members of our community. And they will pursue those interests actively and sometimes with the hardest of hearts. And in fact, the more distant those people become from democratic process, the more difficult it will be for any of us to influence that. So given my time has eclipsed, I'll stop at that point. But we share a deep concern about the interests of the general community around what is happening in the water space, and particularly, and I guess some of you might have seen our work last week where we severely critiqued SA Water's new pricing structure, or the government's new pricing structure, because in fact we calculate that the people who have the least ability to pay will be faced with increases in their water bills of up to 70%, not just the 20% that was announced. Which for anybody living on a tiny income, and people living on New Start allowances live on as little as $34 a day, will be an incredible impost. It will make life incredibly difficult. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ross. As I said, lightning speed. Well, our next speaker is Professor Rob Fowler. Rob is an adjunct professor in the law school at the University of South Australia. He served as Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Adelaide from 1995 to 2008 and held the chair in environmental law at the University of South Australia from 2001 until his retirement in 2008. Rob is currently the President of the Conservation Council of South Australia. Let's welcome Professor Rob Fowler.
Well, they say if you want to spoil a party, invite a lawyer, and I'm probably about to do that because there's some hard truths which in a short 3 minutes I have to put to you. The idea that water is a common resource was recognised by the common law in the 19th century, and the High Court recognised that, but it also went on to say that that was completely overrun by the legislation on water that we've had in place in this country for over 130 years. And under that legislation, the right to water was vested in the Crown, and the Crown then dispenses whatever access to water people are entitled to have. Sadly, in 1994, after a long history of giving people limited rights to water, as a result of the Fred Hilmer inquiry on national competition policy, it was decided to commodify water and give people private rights to it. They now have those rights, and once they have them in their possession, getting them back without paying fair and just compensation is almost inconceivable. And that is why the Commonwealth is trying to buy back water, because it would cost it an absolute packet to do it by any other means. That's the bad news. On the other side, if you look at legislation such as our Natural Resources Management Act here in South Australia, it says that water licences are personal property, that people may trade them, and they do indeed. But it also goes on to say that those are not unlimited rights. It says, for example, that where a water allocation plan is adopted, existing users can have their existing allocations proportionately reduced if there isn't enough water in that system to go around. It also says that the Minister can at any time take water back from the holder of a licence, reduce their allocation for the purposes of protecting water quality or ecosystems. So I put it to you that in terms of what we need to do, there is no point trying to reverse privatisation of water. We are now stuck with it. It will not happen. It cannot happen legally. What we have to do is make those systems work. My last point is this. I think the great tragedy of water privatisation is that even despite that legislation in this state, and there are going to be or already are similar provisions in other states, what has resulted is a kind of culture or a psychology in which the holders of those rights now fight to the death to defend them or to seek full payment for their retrieval by the government. We've actually, in that sense, let the horse bolt. And that's the great difficulty we now face in terms of trying to recover water for the environment. We have the provisions there. It's very sad and very concerning to see the reactions that took place to the guideline on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan before Christmas. I think that's a reflection of that evolving culture. But the answer to that is actually to stick with the way the legislation was written, which says that you look at the environmental needs and then you measure the socio-economic concerns. But that's not how it seems that particular exercise is heading at the moment as a result of those reactions, and I think that's very sad. So I'm certainly not supportive of privatisation, don't get me wrong, but I think we have to be very pragmatic in terms of the way we respond to it now and address it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. Right on the 3 minutes. Fantastic. Our next speaker is Mark Henley. Mark has spent over 30 years working for non-government community service organisations and is committed to reducing poverty and disadvantage. He's a life member of the South Australian Council of Social Service, SACOS, is currently employed by Uniting Care Wesley Adelaide and Uniting Care Australia, for whom he focuses on energy policy. Mark Henley, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'd like to join with others in acknowledging that we meet on Kaurna land, and of course acknowledge that the Kaurna people understood more than anything else the value of the common good. It worked for millennia. So now I want to move on to this question of, well, what can be done about the issues we've talked about tonight so far? And I want to say to you that we need, as advocates, as citizens, to be crystal clear about what are our concerns and what can be done. I suggest to you that there are really some 4 simple principles as essential elements for small customers, small consumers, i.e. households and small business. And whatever reform process we're talking about, they're much the same. Certainly for water, reliability, affordability, fairness and sustainability. I suggest that when we have a reform process going on, there are really 3 different processes that are happening at the outset which we need to be thinking about. The first one is the content, the detail. The second is the process to actually move to the legislation coming into the House, the rules being made, the reform process being instigated. The third part is the ongoing process, what happens after the bill has been through the Parliament. And that's the small slice I want to focus on for the next minute or so, because this is where I think there's some really important action, some demands we can make now to have in place to at least help consumer advocacy for some time to come. So in looking at I've got 5 core elements for ongoing process that I think we need to be advocating for now. One is guaranteed legislated consumer protection. And this is based on the fact that we've got legislation in the South Australian Parliament this year. a whole range of measures, but that's about supply guarantee, price setting, hardship, affordability, etc. The second issue we need to be absolutely clear about is affordability. We need some benchmarks, I suggest, about water affordability. Maybe no household should pay more than 4%? I'm not sure. We need some work on that. I suggest that no price rise should be more than, at a maximum, 10% per annum. We need affordability benchmarks. Number 3, we need consumer representatives on advisory and regulatory bodies. We need to love our regulators, and we have good regulators in this state. We need ongoing consumer involvement with reference groups and with our regulators. Number 4, we actually need funding for community engagement and consumer advocacy to keep up to speed with all of these debates, to make sure that it is a consumer voice that is represented along with big business, along with sort of the merchant bankers. I note that in Victoria there is a consumer utility advocacy centre funded by state government to work on consumer advocacy issues around utilities. I think it is absolutely reasonable that we be making a similar demand of this state government on this issue now. Finally, number 5, we need data. Good data reported, produced, published and made public, so that we can be informed advocates now into the future. My 5 points for action in this slice of the process from here. Thanks for your commitment.
Thank you very much, Mark. Our last speaker on the topic of what can be done is Professor Fran Born. She's Professor of Public Health and an Australian Research Council Federation Fellow at the Flinders University. She is also Foundation Director of the Southgate Institute for Health, Society and Equity and the South Australian Community Health Research Unit. And Fran is co-chair of the Global Steering Committee of the People's Health Movement. Please welcome Professor Fran Born.
Thanks, Deb. And I should say that the People's Health Movement, we have activists in many countries around the world, and water is a key issue there. And I think that's because the history of public health shows that water's been absolutely fundamental. And if we look back to public health in history in the 19th century, governments didn't privatise that. You know, the economies of most of the currently rich countries were built on public management, and it was managed as a public good, not for private profit. We've already heard about how water is vital to health, but I just think these statistics are worth looking at, that currently nearly 1.5 billion people do not have access to clean water, 2.6 billion don't have water and good sanitation, and nearly 2 million people die because of the consumption of unsanitary water each year. So it is absolutely fundamental to our health. The question is, I suppose, is there enough water? And I think in a way the sort of guiding message of what we've heard today is that there's certainly enough for everybody's need, but there's not enough for everybody's greed. And I think that's where the privatisation goes to the heart of this. An Indian economist who's been active in the People's Water Forum has proposed that we really should be shutting down large companies that actually use a lot of our water. And you can see from this quote, they're saying, well, we wouldn't really miss a lot of the products of these companies, but if it would help us in seeking a sustainable lifestyle rather than harming the earth. So I guess that's asking questions about who's using water for what, and don't we really want to use it for health? The other thing about health is that having control over your life is very good for your health, and privatised water reduces our control. Water supply has to produce profits to stakeholders and corporate executives. The prices, we've heard, goes up. Control rests with the multinational companies. The expertise goes offshore, and communities lose control and suffer a sense of helplessness and disempowerment. And I think we saw that in South Australia in terms of the drought. And higher costs has a huge opportunity cost because it means less funds for other things that we can invest in. And even at a household level, when, as Mark's pointed out, poor families will be paying so much for their water, that really means they can't do other things. So the message from me is that we really have to democratise our water because that's good for our health. I think WAC is one of the organisations around the world and networks that are really fighting to have democratic water supply. There's a People's Water Health Forum, there's a Reclaiming Public Water Network, and I've just picked one example from this work, which is a group in Maine in the US, that they actually passed an ordinance that gave their citizens the right to self-government, the right to ecosystems, and they denied corporations the right to claim personhood, which is very often the way that big corporations get legal rights. And the ordinance put their water resources in a common trust to be used for their benefit. And we absolutely need accountability for communities and governments about the need to invest in public good rather than private profit. And I think Mark gave us a good lowdown on that. So my other recommendation tonight would be, it's good for your health if you get involved in civic activity. So why not get involved in WAC? Why not write letters to your politicians? Why not write letters to the paper and become an activist to really make sure that water stays in all our hands, in public hands? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for our four speakers on the issue of what can be done. Now it is time for the politician's right of reply. Penny Wright is a lawyer, mediator and mother, and was elected to the Senate in 2010. She will commence her position as Senator for South Australia for the Australian Greens on the 1st of July 2011. Please welcome Senator-elect Penny Wright.
Thank you, Deb, and good evening, everyone. And I too would like to, I was reflecting on the Kaurna people who've lived here for thousands of years, and it struck me that they knew a thing or two about the importance of water. One of the problems, I think, is that we later arrivals to this dry continent have a bad habit of living on the planet as if we're not subject to the usual laws of nature. Maybe we think, or we're not like other mammals, we have an economy. I'd like to just indicate that the Greens, both federally and state, have been working on many water issues over the years. My colleague in the Senate, Sarah Hanson-Young, has been working on the Murray-Darling Basin. The Greens have been calling for much greater scrutiny and records about the sale of our water resources and our agricultural land by the Foreign Investment Review Board. Currently, there's no record of the sales of those assets overseas, except when they exceed $231 million. So we don't know what overseas interests are buying up our precious water resources and agricultural land. But I think what I'd like to do tonight is focus particularly on the work of my Greens colleagues, Mark Carnell and Tammy Franks in the State Parliament, who've been working on water issues for the last 5 years since Mark Carnell was first elected. Over the last 5 years, they've been involved in many aspects of this, but two parliamentary inquiries in particular. In 2009, the inquiry into SA Water was chaired by Mark Carnell and recommended keeping the ownership and control of the public water and sewerage system in public hands. This year, Tammy Franks is chairing a select committee into the Lonsdale desalination plant. Government and SA Water witnesses are going to have some serious explaining to do in relation to reports of massive profits and dodgy financial dealings around the private sector involvement in that project. Is it true, for instance, that Adelaide Aqua stands to make a $500 million profit out of the project, as has recently been reported in the Advertiser? This afternoon in State Parliament, Mark Carnell, in fact, was calling for an inquiry into the financing of new public infrastructure. Evidence both from here and interstate is that the community gets ripped off and loses control when the government enters these so-called PPPs, or public-private partnerships. Projects such as the desal plant, hospitals and jails are all variations on this theme, that the private sector is best placed to deliver public infrastructure. And that's been the common mantra, but a growing chorus of economists now say that that's wrong. What we have to remember, of course, is that ultimately private companies are duty-bound to maximise the return to shareholders, and that's been reflected in earlier speakers. Governments, on the other hand, should be duty-bound to maximise the well-being of the community and to protect the environment. When it comes to something as essential as water, all key decisions must be made in the public interest. Where private companies are involved, it must be in a secondary role to provide those services that government can't do itself. And just to flag what's coming up next, a new State Water Industry Act was put out for public consultation last year with the intention of introducing it to Parliament this year. The Water Action Coalition, I acknowledge and know, made a submission describing it as, quotes, a radical market privatisation experiment. Other submissions highlighted the lack of vision and missed opportunities for a truly ecologically sustainable water management regime. When the bill finally comes before Parliament, the Greens will do what we can to improve it and to make sure that the public interest is dominant. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. Now, I don't want to be rude to politicians, but that's not something you see every day, politicians keeping within 3 minutes, so the pressure is now on Adrian. Adrian Frederick is the member for Hammond and is the Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Food and Fisheries and Forests. He was previously Shadow Minister for the River Murray from September 2008 to March 2010. Please welcome Adrian Frederick.
Thank you, Deb, and I'd like to acknowledge Senator-elect Penny Wright and everyone here today, and thanks for the opportunity to speak at the forum sponsored by the Water Action Coalition. SA Water, prior to reform in the mid-1990s, was a financial burden on South Australian taxpayers. The then Liberal government simply outsourced the maintenance of SA Water's infrastructure. Not one dam, pipe, pump, tap, sewer, water treatment plant was sold. Yet politically, this was claimed to be a privatisation. Notwithstanding, the reforms turned SA Water into a business, delivering substantial revenues to state government, so much so that those revenues are an integral part of government's annual budget and are now protected by rapidly increasing water charges. This raises the question, is the current government's aversion to the use of recycled stormwater for potable use because this business is undertaken by local government and as such presents a risk to SA Water's business? Our water reforms have been about opening up opportunities to have the private sector compete in the water delivery space. My earlier comments regarding SA Water and the outsourcing of its maintenance contract, I believe, indicate that private sector involvement and competition can deliver cost savings to both consumers and taxpayers. With regard to the management of the Murray-Darling Basin, it is erroneous to believe that there has been a privatisation of the waters in that system. Irrigators have always had a right to water, which has underpinned their investment both in infrastructure and plantations. The changes under COAG water reforms to ensure those property rights are freely tradable to allow the use of water to be moved to the highest value production. This has been sensible public policy and should not be confused with the problems caused by over-allocation. In South Australia, we have a proud record of not having issued any new water licences since the early 1970s, whereas other jurisdictions such as New South Wales and more latterly Queensland have issued additional water licences from the rivers and then from groundwater systems, which are of course connected to the river, and recently allowed the practice of floodplain harvesting, which again impacts on river flows. It is politicians who have allowed this to happen, just as it has been politicians who failed to grasp the opportunity presented in 2007 when there was widespread political will to reform the basin management. South Australia was just as culpable in that as any other state, notwithstanding we had the most to gain. And certainly I'd just like to make some closing comments in regard serving the electorate at the bottom end of the river. I've certainly noticed the pain of the River Murray, not just for people in the city reliant on urban water supply, but the pain of people seeing the ecology fail under a system that's been over-allocated, and we haven't seen the implementations of water reform instigated in the eastern states that could have happened with the $5.9 billion put up for infrastructure by the then Howard government to transform those open channels into pipe pressure systems like we have here in South Australia. Thank you.
Both the four speakers speaking on what can be done and our politicians. I do need to let you know that an invitation was extended to the State Water Minister, Paul Kiker, to attend tonight's forum, but he declined on the basis that Parliament was sitting and he was required for parliamentary duties. An invitation was also extended to Tony Burke from the federal government, who also declined due to other commitments. So now it is that time of the evening when it's your turn. You've had so much information to digest, I know, but if you have some questions that you would now like to ask our panel, then this is the time to do it. All I'm going to ask you to do is, if you wouldn't mind forming two lines, one, if you wouldn't mind, down that side. If you do have a question, if you could identify the speaker to whom the question's directed and make it in the nature of a question rather than opinion, if possible. Now, who'd like to go first? Who have we got? I don't know if people are leaving or people are lining up. No? Does anyone have a question? Okay, sir, is it possible to extend a radio mic to this man? Yes, sorry, we've got some very helpful people here. Thank you.
Thank you, Lady Chair. My question is to anyone that could answer the question properly. Now, Salisbury Council has proved that water, the runoff water from Adelaide and metropolitan area can be recycled successfully with their very limited finance. Why the two political parties have tossed around that particular subject, and neither of them have actually properly explained why didn't the government proceed with it before it made decision to the desalination plant, which A, very expensive, two, we don't know what the damage is going to do to the Gulf. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, there's no one here from the state government, but I think Adrian Frederick, if you wouldn't mind answering that.
Thank you, Deb, and thanks for the question. Look, back a few years ago, when I was first elected to Parliament, I went over to Perth and witnessed what it cost them for their first 50 gigalitre desal plant. That plant, with the associated pipe infrastructure, was built for $387 million, which prompted us to have the policy as Liberals to build a 50 gigalitre plant, and we still firmly believe that would have been big enough for this state. Labor hesitated for 2 years, and hence we see the cost of $1.8 billion plus over $400 million to hook that plant right throughout the system. But certainly going into the 2010 election on our side of politics, we had a policy of capturing 89 gigalitres of stormwater and putting that into 13 underground basins, and that would have taken time, and it would have taken quite a few years. But using the technology of Salisbury Council, which has been proven, it does work, we believe that we could have got a lot of water that falls on this fair city, cleaned it up, put it back into the system and used it for the public. It's used in Europe, it's used in New South Wales, but the government here decided it was a public health risk. Well, I'm sorry, all water can be cleaned up. Thank you.
Thank you. Penny Wright would like to add to that.
Thank you. If I can just add to that, the Greens commissioned a report several years ago which indicated very clearly that it's not necessary to go down the desalination option, and we'll all be paying the price for that for many years to come. Indeed, the capture of stormwater, the reuse of it, demand management and recycling were all far better options and far better for the environment. I think it's really ironic that one of the effects that we know and has been clearly predicted by many scientists of climate change is a reduction in rainfall, and we know how energy intensive desalination plants are that are popping up all around Australia and the world, and in fact they're going to be feeding into that whole cycle of further greenhouse gas emissions, further climate change, further depletion of our rainfall and our water resources. It's just a crazy way to go.
Thank you. Next question. Don't be shy, it's a painless process. Sir? Okay.
Thank you. This one might be for John Caldecott. I come from California, which has very similar water misuse problems here. And it was a shock to me to find out that until just a few years ago, no one in California actually studied groundwater as it connected to river water. River water and lakes were studied thoroughly, allocated. No one paid any attention to groundwater, assumed it was completely separate. In South Australia, what are the rules, and is there a study, is there an understanding that groundwater feeds into river water and should be allocated just like any other water?
Thanks for the question. Yeah, look, the CSIRO Sustainability Yields Project was initiated by the Howard government, and I think at the time it was the biggest CSIRO project. They spent a couple of years investigating that connection, so there is a much stronger bed of information on groundwater and surface water, river flows interactions.
Can I just add that
Certainly.
in South Australia, where we have what are called prescribed areas that need regulation of water allocation, many of them are prescribed and regulated in relation to both surface and groundwater, so they're seen as connected resources. And that's reflected in the plans that are produced for those areas.
Thank you. Any more questions? This lady over here.
We all like to get value for our taxes, whether it's called levy or whatever. In regard to the River Murray levy, I wonder what's happened to that water, that money, and can anyone tell me if it has been spent, and if not, how you would like to spend it? I don't mind who answers that question.
All right. The River Murray levy has helped fund things like salt interception schemes, and certainly that's been something that's kept helping with the 2 million tonnes of salt that comes down the river annually. I can note people not wishing to pay the levy because maybe they're not connected to the river, or they think the river is scot-free at the minute. Yes, the river is looking pretty good at the minute, but there's also other projects that the NRM boards operate on for the sustainability of the river. And the issue for governments, and I'm in opposition, so I could give them a hard slap, but I also have to make a budget balance with my party if we get in 2014. Budget measures are going to be very hard to roll back, especially with what I think the state of the budget will be in nearly 3 years' time. It's already in a terrible state, but it certainly does go to projects involved in the Murray, but sadly in the previous 4 or 5 years, some of those monies haven't been spent, but in the last couple of years all of those funds have been spent.
Would anyone else like to answer that? No? Thank you. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. Lady up here, please. Oh, sorry, okay. Perhaps we'll go for the gentleman up here first. There's the microphones there.
Thank you. I'd like to direct this probably to Mark Henley first and foremost. As one of the small water consumers that you were touching on, I'm really perplexed as to how any ground can be made with getting people to value water more highly when, in my case at least, 80% of my water bill is a sewerage access fee, which is basically a property tax, which is possibly why the government is so dependent upon this resource, because if they were to actually give us the power to reduce our water use and therefore reduce the amount we pay, they would end up with less income. So I'm just wondering, with the kind of fairness approach that you mentioned, perhaps I think you said a 4% of income, how you might envisage that being applied and how we can actually get some action with that.
You ask a really important question, and that's about how tariffs are structured. And look, I don't think time permits us to go into too much detail. But the issue is when you have a flat price, and many water, electricity, other things have a flat price, it means that low-income people actually pay proportionately more than higher-income people. So that's actually why a property tax has been used as a means of determining the supply charge for water. So it's actually a more equitable approach. I would argue it's a fairer approach than the approach we have with electricity, etc., where there's basically a flat supply charge. So, and that's a philosophical issue, but that's certainly where I come from, that a property-based charge is in fact more equitable than a flat charge. The other thing I need to make clear is that when you actually look at pricing for any utility, whether it's broadband, water, electricity, whatever, a large part of the actual cost of supply comes from the distribution mechanism, the pipes in the case of water. So capturing the water is relatively straightforward. It's actually the big cost is in that infrastructure, and that's why supply charges are part of the billing mix to actually meet the cost of maintaining and extending that distribution network. So they're two of the factors that are at play in both water and sewage charging. So look, for me, from my views of what fairness means, I suggest actually maintaining some sort of a property-based charge is actually a fairer way to go than a flat price for everybody.
But does that address the question of how...
You spoke about income as being a critical factor. Not property value. If you're living in a property that is of high value, but you have very little income, you still get charged. You know, my personal income is less than $20,000 a year. Because of the property I have to live in, I'm getting charged a ridiculous amount of water tax, not because there's no resemblance to my ability to pay for it, which is exactly the point I thought you were making.
Yeah, I mean, you make a very important point, and in fact, there's probably not a whole lot of people that actually are in the, and when you're looking at sort of how you develop broad principles, there's not a whole lot of people that actually have relatively high property values and relatively low income. So in that situation, I think there does need to be some adjustment to pricing mechanisms. But look, I'm happy to talk more in perhaps offline, but I'll leave it at that, I think, at the moment.
Thank you very much. And this lady here, please.
My question was probably to the politicians. When you were talking earlier about the amount of water used to produce rice and cotton, well, where someone was talking about it, I wondered, is there any potential for refusing people permission to grow high water use in agricultural products, so that there's actually a limit or some sort of sensible way of stopping them overproducing things like rice and cotton?
Adrian, yeah, sure.
Yeah, a very good question, and technically the drought did iron out a lot of those crops. I was up in New South Wales in the last couple of years talking to rice growing corporations, and they were actually importing rice from Asia to make up their contracts. Now, you wouldn't think that would happen, but they were certainly in the Griffiths area importing rice to make up their local contracts. Now, I think where the imbalance, and this is where I talked about over-allocation before, comes in the different allocation scenarios across the Murray-Darling Basin, whereas you'll have high security water, which is more for your permanent plantings, and South Australia is almost all permanent plantings. About 96% of our irrigation is used for vineyards and other plantings like that. And then there's other high security water across the basin. And this is where we had the tradable aspect of water during the drought. You had the Murrumbidgee that a lot of the time during the drought was on 95% allocation, and one year we were only on 18%, supposedly both on high security allocation. So I think that's where a lot of the inequity is, and that's where it costs South Australian irrigators hundreds of millions of dollars in those few years to trade water in, and the guys at the Murrumbidgee that decided they didn't want to grow crops, all they had to do was sit back and fill up their bank balance. Now look, they were sad too, they couldn't grow crops, and we need some equity in the situation. But generally rice and cotton are grown on low security water, generally opportunity water, and certainly in a flood, when the water's there, they have the right to grow it. But I think that the problem is the allocation system being managed by separate states is totally flawed, because there were times during the drought where low security water in the eastern states was higher than what we were getting as supposed high security water. South Australia always gets treated as the poor cousins, because then that reflected on the amount of water we had on top of irrigation for critical human needs. So it does more or less iron out in the system, but there is still a reasonable amount of it grown. And just if I can quickly, the efficiencies I talked about earlier can be made in the basin. I visited a tomato growing property up near Deniliquin. 600 acres of broadacre tomatoes. I've never seen anything like it. Massive property. But what this bloke had done, he only gets low security water. In a year where he had, this is the Rarato family, he had no water, so he's on zero allocation. He spent $700,000 of his own money. He couldn't use any of the water. So he just spent the money. The next year when he was on 9% allocation, he doubled his efficiency. because he put in all these irrigation lines, and instead of having just channels and basically a low form of flood irrigation, he put all his irrigation, mini irrigation pipes in, and he went from he managed to make 9% turn into 18% water. So I believe that especially in the eastern states where those reforms can be made, we can make the reforms to the irrigation sector there and still put plenty of water back into the river and still keep our food production up across the basin.
Thanks, Adrian. We'll hear from John Caldecott, then we'll hear from Ian Douglas.
Just a brief comment. Our submission number 596 to the Tony Windsor Parliamentary Inquiry goes into detail, but it's pretty clear from thinking about it that when the variability of the basin diversions varies from 4,000 gigalitres to 15,000 gigalitres, it needs to be prioritised. We don't need to worry about what's grown when there's plenty of water, but as soon as it starts to decrease, we need to make decisions about what's grown, place caps, and water for the environment, water for Australians, comes before water being exported.
Ian?
Just as an aside, there is such a thing as the National Weeds Register. And on that register are listed all the toxic plants in this country and the reasons or their adverse properties that allows them to be listed on that register. If you take a reasonably pragmatic approach to it, you can define that cotton ticks about 7 of the boxes out of 10 in regards to adverse effects on ecosystems, native plants and watercourses. Blackberries, brambles as we call them in Scotland, tick only 6 boxes. Just an aside.
And just briefly, sorry.
Very quick one. I just urge all of you to take a very keen interest in the Murray-Darling Basin Plan when it is released, because it's the mechanism through which some of those issues should be addressed. Whether it will be or not is the huge question. The system is over-allocated, and the guidelines that were released before Christmas suggested a process by which that could be addressed with a significant retrieval of water for the environment and then addressing the related socio-economic problems. That's now really under challenge, so we have to hope that that still holds firm. And I do urge you all to take a keen interest in that, because in the next few months we will see that plan and there will be quite a debate.
Sorry, thank you, Rob. Final quick word from
Penny.
Penny.
Yes, and I'll just pick up on 2 quick points on that. One is picking up on what Rob said there, and something the Greens have continually called for is a truly independent Murray-Darling Basin Authority, so that they have the power to actually do the proper science, make the determinations, act and force compliance without having to constantly have this argy-bargy and the political self-interest that we're never going to get away from while we have the states vying for and the politicians vying for votes. We actually need a truly independent authority. And the second question I think is a really interesting one to take out of what you've said there, and that is something that Ian mentioned earlier on, and that is thinking about what do we mean by high value. Because we know that in a lot of the ways that we actually value the commodities and the things that we use in our lives, the externalities aren't factored in. And it just brings us back to the fact that this is an essential resource, and having clean water to drink may not be, in fact, a very high cost or a high value way of using the water if we're going to look at a market. But on the other hand, if we don't have it, we ain't going to last very long. So that's something important to think about, I think.
Now, look, we have run a little bit over time, so I think we'll draw the questions to a close there. Before I hand back proceedings to Richard Watson from the Water Action Coalition, I'd just like to say a couple of things. One is to thank the Coalition for inviting me to be involved in this forum tonight. Secondly, to thank you very much, everyone that's come here, and I hope you've, learnt something new, or that you've got lots of food for thought to take away from tonight. And I would like you also please to join with me in congratulating not only yourselves for coming out on a Wednesday night for this forum, but also our speakers that have spoken tonight. Thanks, Richard.
Well, we also have to thank Deb as well, and I notice in the last few days there's been more discussion on the ABC about water than we've had for some time, and I'm sure that Deb hasn't played a part in that, but it's good to see that sometimes initiatives like this are generating public debate at the moment. There's a reference here to a call to action, a close of the forum. I notice we're over time, and I think the best thing is that I will be preparing a summary of some of the themes to emerge from the night and post them on our website. But clearly there are some strong messages of concern that arise out of this sort of discussion. And there are obviously many issues to be assessed. I pass on my thanks again then to all of the speakers. It's been an interesting night, and the issues are complex, and it's hard to get your head around many of the themes that have been presented. So we'll work through this, but I think the main theme is that stay involved, stay interested, continue to be critical, and continue to try and understand what is a complex issue as we move towards the next phase of trying to come to grips with the consequences of many of the decisions of the last 2 years as we've gone through this extraordinary period of change from drought and now to the flood and now to the environmental consequences, the social consequences and the economic consequences of the investments that are now being made very quickly. So that's the end of tonight. Thank you all. It's good to see a turnout, and the cough factor hasn't been too great, so obviously you've stayed involved through the evening. So once again, thank you, and thank you to the Hawke Centre and Elizabeth for facilitating yet another one of these debates. Thank you.